A collapsed cabin, a single mom with nothing but hope and determination, and a baby to care for. This is where the story begins. With no money and a future that seemed impossible, she faced a challenge that would test every ounce of strength she had. But against all odds, she transformed a forgotten shack into a home full of love, warmth, and possibility. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories about resilience and transformation, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will inspire you even more. It had been a rough few months. Sarah's life had been in freefall ever since she lost her job at the local diner. Bills piled up, and every day felt like one step closer to losing everything. She had tried her best to hold it together for Liam, her baby boy, but the pressure was beginning to show. Their small apartment was no longer the warm, safe place it once was. The walls seemed to close in, and the air, thick with worry, made it hard to breathe. Sarah knew she had to do something before it was too late. It was on one of those sleepless nights that Sarah, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, made a decision. She had heard whispers from the locals about an abandoned cabin just outside of town. It was a place that had long been forgotten, swallowed by the trees and vines. The cabin's roof sagged under the weight of time, its windows broken, and the floorboards rotted. But something about it called to her. She needed a fresh start, and maybe, just maybe, this place could be it. With a trembling heart, she packed a bag, bundled up Liam in his warmest blanket, and set out in the early morning fog. Her feet crunching on the overgrown path, the scent of damp earth and moss thick in the air, Sarah approached the cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at the world she was leaving behind. The uncertainty was terrifying, but the thought of giving up was even worse. "This is it," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice barely a murmur. "This is our chance." She stepped inside the crumbling structure, her boots echoing on the hollow wooden floor. The space was filled with the remnants of its past old furniture, covered in dust, shattered windows letting the cold wind in. But Sarah's eyes weren't drawn to the decay. Instead, she saw potential. There was something raw and beautiful about the cabin's bones. It was like a blank canvas, waiting for her to paint a new life. As Sarah stood there, holding Liam tightly in her arms, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. This cabin, this abandoned wreck, was about to become their home. She didn't know how long it would take or what it would cost her. But for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hope stirring in her chest. The first few days were the hardest. The cabin, though filled with potential, was in far worse shape than Sarah had imagined. The roof leaked whenever it rained, and the floor creaked with every step. There were no working lights, no running water, and no heat. But Sarah wasn't about to let that stop her. She had a baby to care for, and giving up was never an option. Each morning, after feeding Liam, Sarah set to work. She started with small things, like clearing away the debris that had piled up over the years. Old, rusty tools were scattered around the yard, left behind by whoever had once lived here. Some of them were too far gone to salvage, but a few an old hammer, a shovel had the potential to help rebuild the life she and Liam would now live. She spent her nights sitting on the floor, sketching out plans for the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was something. A plan, a direction. Every time she looked at those drawings, Sarah saw more than just the ruin. She saw rooms filled with love, a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread, and a little bedroom where Liam would grow up safe and happy. But no matter how much work she put in, there was always more to do. It felt like an endless cycle: fix one thing, only to find two more things broken. The walls had holes, the windows were shattered, and the roof, which she knew would need repairs, was a looming worry. Sarah didn't have the money for contractors, and she certainly didn't have the manpower to take it on alone. The local townsfolk didn't exactly offer their help either. Some looked at her with pity, others with confusion. "She's got no chance," they'd say behind her back. "That place is beyond saving." But there was one thing they didn't know about Sarah. She didn't give up, ever. One day, while searching through a nearby junkyard for more tools, she met Tom. He was an old carpenter, a man with rough hands and a kinder heart than most would expect from someone who had lived a hard life. He'd heard about the cabin and had come to see it for himself. "Looking for something to fix, huh?" he asked, standing in the doorway. His voice was warm but lined with years of experience. "I'm trying," Sarah replied, her hands on her hips. "But it's harder than I thought." Tom chuckled. "I've seen worse," he said, stepping inside. "Not much worse, mind you, but I've seen worse." He paused and looked around. "You're gonna need help, though. A lot of it. And I've got some skills I can share." At first, Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to rely on anyone, but she knew better than to refuse help when it was offered. Slowly, over the following weeks, Tom became more than just a carpenter. He became a friend, someone who would show up with tools, wood, and sometimes just a cup of coffee when she needed a break. His help was invaluable, but it wasn't just the physical work that made a difference, it was the reassurance that Sarah wasn't alone in this fight. Bit by bit, the cabin started to change. The roof was patched, the windows replaced, and the walls were sealed up. There was still so much to do, but each small improvement brought Sarah closer to her goal, and with every nail she hammered into place, she could feel the foundation of their new life growing stronger. By the end of the month, the cabin no longer felt like a forgotten ruin. It felt like home. The first major breakthrough came when Sarah managed to get the plumbing working. It was a long and grueling process, one that involved more than a few failed attempts and moments of frustration. But with Tom's guidance and her determination, she fixed the leaky pipes that had caused so much trouble. The moment the water began to flow, it felt like more than just a victory, it felt like a lifeline. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring at the steady stream from the newly installed faucet. It was just water, but to her, it was a symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she was building. It meant that they could wash their hands, do dishes, and, for the first time in months, have a small taste of normalcy. That night, Sarah made a simple dinner soup and bread by candlelight. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. As she sat across from Liam, who was now old enough to sit up on his own, she watched him play with his food, his little hands smearing butter on the table. She smiled at the mess, feeling a warmth inside that had nothing to do with the tiny wood stove they had rigged up in the corner. Tom had gone back to town to get some more materials, leaving Sarah alone for a few days to work. She found herself reflecting on how far she had come. When she first set foot in this cabin, it had felt like the end of the world. Now, with each passing day, it felt more like the beginning. The days blurred together, filled with hard work and small moments of joy. Sarah had become accustomed to the rhythm of her new life, the sound of the hammer ringing out in the quiet mornings, the smell of fresh paint, and the soft murmur of Liam cooing as he explored the space around him. She even found time to plant a small garden out back. It wasn't much, but the first green shoots that sprouted from the earth felt like a promise of better days to come. But it wasn't just the physical work that kept her going, it was the way the cabin was beginning to reflect her. Each crack in the walls, each uneven floorboard, told a story of perseverance, of never giving up. The imperfections were hers. They were part of the journey, part of the process. And slowly, very slowly, the cabin was becoming more than just a place to live. It was becoming a home she could be proud of, a home that Liam would one day look back on and know that it was built with love, with care, and with the kind of strength only a mother's heart could provide. One afternoon, as Sarah was sanding down a wooden beam, Liam began to crawl toward the small stack of books she had set aside for him. She stopped for a moment to watch him, her heart swelling with pride. In his little hands, he picked up a worn picture book, holding it out to her as if offering her a gift. Sarah smiled, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay, Liam," she whispered, her fingers brushing through his soft hair. "We're going to be okay." And with that, she returned to her work, the steady rhythm of the hammer marking time in the background. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was the foundation of a new life, one where anything was possible. The days passed, and the cabin continued to evolve. What had once been a crumbling ruin was slowly transforming into a cozy, livable space. But with every victory, new challenges seemed to surface, each one more difficult than the last. For every wall Sarah repaired, there were two more that needed attention. For every inch of progress she made, there was another setback that threatened to undo it all. One evening, after a long day of work, Sarah sat on the porch, staring at the sun dipping below and the horizon. Liam was asleep in his makeshift crib beside her, the gentle breeze rustling the trees around them. She had worked hard all day, sawing, hammering, sanding, and yet, it felt like the cabin was still so far from what she dreamed it could be. It wasn't the physical labor that weighed on her the most. It was the emotional toll of constantly feeling like she was never doing enough. She was alone. Every decision, every challenge, rested on her shoulders. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, and some days, the isolation felt suffocating. The evenings were the hardest. With Liam tucked in bed, Sarah would often sit by the small stove, her hands trembling as she tried to hold the pieces of her life together. She would look around at the cabin, so full of potential, but still so imperfect, and wonder if it would ever truly feel like home. One night, as she sat in the dim glow of the stove, a knock came at the door. Startled, Sarah stood and made her way to the front, her heart racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Tom standing on the doorstep, holding a large box. "Thought you might need some extra hands," he said with a smile, his weathered face lighting up in the soft moonlight. "I brought you some supplies, and I thought, maybe I could help with the roof tomorrow. It's gonna need a proper patch before winter sets in." Sarah looked at him, surprised by his unexpected generosity. "You don't have to do that," she replied, her voice soft. "I know I don't have to," Tom said, his tone gentle but firm. "But I want to. You've got a good thing going here, Sarah. Don't let it slip away because you're trying to do it all by yourself." Sarah's chest tightened. She had been so determined to handle everything alone, to prove to herself that she could manage. But in that moment, she realized how much she had been carrying too much for one person to bear. "I'm not used to asking for help," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Tom's expression softened. "No one should have to do it alone. We all need a little help sometimes." The box he handed her contained more than just materials. It contained a sense of relief. Sarah hadn't realized how much she needed someone to reach out, to remind her that she wasn't alone in this fight. With Tom's help, the roof would finally be fixed, and with every repair, the cabin would feel just a little more like home. The next day, Tom returned as promised, bringing more tools and extra hands from the town. Together, they patched the roof, reinforced the walls, and made sure the cabin could weather whatever storms came next. As the work progressed, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to accept help, and it made all the difference. As the sun set that evening, Sarah stood on the porch once more, this time with a small smile on her face. The cabin wasn't finished yet, far from it, but it was better. And so was she. The weather began to change as fall set in, and with it came new challenges. The cabin, though it had come a long way, still lacked the warmth and comfort Sarah had hoped for. As the nights grew colder, Sarah's hands, calloused and bruised from months of labor, began to ache. She worked tirelessly during the day, but the nights were long, and the warmth she had worked so hard to create in the cabin always seemed to slip away when the sun set. But one morning, Sarah woke up to find a surprise. Tom had returned, but this time, he wasn't alone. He brought with him a small group of neighbors, people who had heard about her struggles and wanted to lend a hand. They arrived with wood, blankets, and supplies Sarah hadn't been able to afford. Together, they worked to add insulation to the cabin, making sure it would hold the heat during the coming winter months. Sarah could hardly believe the outpouring of support. It was more than just physical help. It was the emotional boost she desperately needed. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting a losing battle. But now, for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The sense of community, the connection to others who cared, was something she hadn't known she needed until it was right in front of her. By the end of the week, the cabin was warmer. The insulation made a huge difference, and Sarah found herself feeling more at peace, knowing that she could give Liam a safe and comfortable place to sleep. As the days passed, she even managed to set up a small wood stove that would keep them warm throughout the cold months. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, so much still to repair, but Sarah had learned something important. No matter how tough things got, there was always a flicker of light to guide her through. Whether it was a hand from a neighbor or a small victory in the cabin, she knew she had the strength to keep going. The weather grew colder as the leaves turned golden and fell, and Sarah's thoughts began to turn inward. As the first snowflakes began to dust the ground, she focused on the growing list of tasks that needed to be tackled. But no matter how hard she worked, there were some things she simply couldn't do alone. The physical toll was exhausting, and the emotional weight of carrying the future of her and Liam on her shoulders was becoming too heavy to bear. The isolation began to creep back in. But then, one crisp morning, as Sarah was patching the last remaining hole in the cabin's doorframe, a sound of laughter reached her ears. She looked up to find Mrs. Avery, a retired schoolteacher from down the road, standing in her yard with a basket of freshly baked bread. Behind her, several others followed. Tom, of course, but also newcomers, other neighbors who had heard about Sarah's efforts and decided to lend a hand. They came with tools, supplies, and most importantly, a sense of community Sarah hadn't expected. "I figured you'd be in need of some bread and a little help, Mrs. Avery said, her voice full of warmth as she handed over the basket. "We're all in this together." And just like that, Sarah's world changed. What started as one person helping became a network of people who wanted nothing more than to see Sarah succeed. The group didn't just bring tools and materials, they brought hope, and with it, a renewed sense of belonging. They worked side by side, patching the roof, reinforcing walls, and adding insulation to ensure the cabin would be as warm as it could be. They brought lunch every day, and sometimes, when Sarah's hands were too tired to keep working, they simply sat with her and talked. Through the quiet conversations, the shared smiles, and the labor done together, Sarah realized something profound. She wasn't alone. There was strength in numbers, in the bond of people who were willing to invest not only in her cabin but in her spirit. As they worked together, the cabin came to life. Sarah found herself learning from them, from their experiences and wisdom. And in the midst of it all, something beautiful happened. The cabin became more than just a shelter. It became a symbol of resilience, not just her own, but the community's. The days continued to grow shorter as winter crept in, but Sarah's determination never wavered. Each day brought new challenges, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Between tending to Liam and working on the cabin, she barely had time to rest. But there was something about her son's laughter, his wide-eyed curiosity as he explored the space around them, that kept her going. No matter how tired she was, seeing him smile made every hour of hard work worthwhile. Sarah had learned to adapt. As much as she wanted to focus solely on the cabin, she also had to balance being a mother. Some nights, she stayed up long after Liam had fallen asleep, quietly, repairing the cracks in the walls or sanding down the rough edges of furniture. When her hands were too sore to work, she'd hold Liam close, humming him to sleep, cherishing the moments of peace in between the chaos of construction. One cold afternoon, as Sarah worked on restoring the cabin's front steps, she saw Liam crawling across the floor, his chubby hands grasping the wood, pulling himself up to stand. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched him take his first tentative steps toward the door, his tiny feet unsteady but determined. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, staring at her son as he tested his limits, much like she had been doing for months. She realized that, just like him, she had learned to take small, unsteady steps. She wasn't perfect, and her path was still rough, but with every small effort, she was getting closer to the life she'd dreamed of. That evening, after a long day of work, Sarah sat by the fire with Liam in her lap. The flames flickered softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. She held him close, his tiny body curled against hers, and whispered, "You're my reason, Liam. You make me stronger than I ever thought I could be." Sarah's journey had been one of overwhelming challenges, but it had also been one of growth, both for her and for her son. She had learned to push through the toughest days, to trust in herself and her ability to create a home. And as the days grew colder, Sarah knew one thing for certain: she was capable. Her strength, driven by love and a fierce determination, would carry them both through whatever came next. As winter settled in, the cabin, though far from perfect, had become a sanctuary. Sarah's work was far from done, but the constant cycle of labor had taken on a new rhythm. Each morning, she would wake up to the sound of the wind howling outside, the cabin's sturdy walls offering a comforting shelter from the cold. The small wood stove, though simple, provided warmth, and Sarah had learned to make the most of it. They were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to live, but every day presented a new challenge. Sometimes, the fire would die out during the night, leaving them to wake up to a cold, empty room. Other times, Sarah had to make do with the little food they had, finding ways to stretch the small portions to last as long as possible. It wasn't easy, but each moment felt like a step forward. Each patch of the roof, each fixed window, each wall she painted with a fresh coat of hope, was a victory in itself. One evening, after a long day of shoveling snow and gathering firewood, Sarah sat on the porch with Liam in her arms, gazing at the snow-covered landscape. The world around them seemed so still, so silent. But in that silence, Sarah felt a sense of peace she had never known. She no longer felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her. The future wasn't as uncertain as it once seemed. She had built this life, this small but warm home, and she could continue to build it, one step at a time. The promise of tomorrow seemed more tangible now. It wasn't about some grand, unattainable dream. It was about today, about making the best of what she had, knowing that each day she worked, she was building a foundation for something lasting. The cabin wasn't just a place to live, it was a promise to herself and to Liam that they would create something beautiful, no matter how small the steps. With the first signs of spring approaching, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The garden she had started planting in the back of the cabin had begun to sprout, the first tiny green leaves poking through the soil. It was a small thing, but it was a symbol of new beginnings, of hope, and of the strength that had carried them this far. In the quiet of that evening, Sarah whispered to Liam, "We're going to make it. We're going to make this home everything we need it to be." The first winter in the cabin was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Despite the improvements made over the month's insulation, the wood stove, and patched-up walls, the cold still crept in during the long nights. The wind howled through the cracks, and the snow piled up outside in thick white drifts. Yet, every time Sarah sat beside the stove, watching the flames flicker, she reminded herself how far they had come. It was their first winter in their new home, and that alone felt like a victory. Liam, now growing more active, would toddle around the small cabin, his tiny feet stumbling on the cold wooden floor. Sarah made sure he was bundled up warmly, and she spent hours playing with him inside, inventing games to keep both of them entertained. There was still a long way to go, but each time she saw Liam's smile, she knew it was all worth it. Though the cabin wasn't fully completed, Sarah had made it livable. There was food in the pantry preserved from the small garden she had started in the fall, and the woodpile outside was growing larger by the day. She had learned to stretch every dollar, and each small triumph, like gathering firewood in the freezing cold or managing to fix a broken pipe, gave her a renewed sense of hope. These were not just tasks to survive. They were steps toward building something lasting. The nights were still long, and the silence of the cabin, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire, made Sarah reflect on everything she had sacrificed. There were nights she lay awake, feeling the weight of the world on her chest, wondering if she was doing enough. But when she looked at Liam, curled up peacefully next to her, those doubts slowly faded. As the snow continued to fall outside, Sarah made a promise to herself and to Liam. This winter would be their last without warmth, without certainty. They would continue to build, and the following year would be better. She believed it with every fiber of her being. And when the days started to lengthen, and the first hints of spring poked through the cold earth, Sarah knew that the future she had fought so hard for was finally starting to take shape. With the first signs of spring came a renewed sense of energy. The snow melted, revealing the earth beneath, soft and rich, ready to be worked. Sarah's body ached from the long winter, but the promise of new growth filled her with determination. She spent the first warm days preparing the garden for the season ahead. The small patch of land behind the cabin, which had been little more than frozen ground months ago, was now soft and welcoming, ready to receive new seeds. As Sarah worked, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm, it was a home. It had walls that held memories and love, a roof that protected them, and a warmth that came not just from the stove, but from the people who had helped her get there. The garden, though modest, symbolized everything she had worked for: a new beginning, a chance for growth, and a life they could call their own. Liam, now walking steadily, followed her around the garden, his small hands touching the dirt as though he understood the significance of what they were doing. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched him explore, his curiosity and wonder infectious. He was growing, just as the cabin was, just as she was. With each passing day, Sarah was becoming the woman she had always known she could be: a mother, a builder, and someone who could create something beautiful from nothing. By the end of the week, Sarah had planted vegetables, herbs, and flowers in the garden. She knew it wouldn't be a miracle. Nothing about this journey had been easy, but it was something real. The first shoots of green were already beginning to peek through the soil, promising a harvest that would feed them in the months to come. As she stood in the garden, surrounded by the promise of new life, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. They were thriving. And with Liam by her side, she knew the future would be brighter than ever. As the sun set over the cabin, casting a golden light across the land, Sarah whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." The early days of spring brought with them a new sense of hope, but they also exposed the harsh realities that came with rebuilding a life from the ground up. As Sarah toiled away, planting more crops, mending the cabin's foundation, and tending to Liam, the weight of the work began to take its toll. What was once a simple dream of creating a home now felt like an overwhelming burden, and the pressure seemed to increase with every passing day. The roof needed repairs again, the plumbing had started leaking once more, and a particularly harsh rainstorm the night before had flooded parts of the floor, undoing some of Sarah's hard work. No matter how many steps forward she took, there were always setbacks, always something new that demanded her attention. And this time, Sarah felt like she couldn't handle it. That night, after a full day of work, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She was exhausted physically, emotionally, and mentally. Her muscles ached, her heart heavy, and the burden of being both mother and sole caretaker of their new life felt unbearable. For the first time since she started this journey, Sarah thought about walking away. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe the dream of a peaceful life in the cabin was just that, a dream. But then she heard it, the soft sound of Liam's breathing as he slept peacefully in his crib, the sound of his small hands reaching up toward her in his sleep. That sound, that tiny heartbeat, was all the reminder she needed. She wasn't doing this just for herself. She was doing it for him. And in that moment, when everything felt like it was falling apart, Sarah found the strength she thought she had lost. The next morning, she woke early. Instead of retreating, she pushed herself to keep going. She took small, purposeful steps, fixing what she could, cleaning what needed attention, and planting seeds for the future. It was in the simplest tasks that she rediscovered her sense of purpose. Though she couldn't fix everything, she could keep moving forward, 1 inch at a time. And that's what she did. Slowly but surely, Sarah rebuilt herself as much as she did the cabin. It was not just the walls she had to mend, it was the fragments of her own spirit. She didn't need to do it alone. She had learned to rely on others. She had learned that the journey was not about perfection, but about resilience. The days following Sarah's moment of doubt were marked by a quiet transformation. It was subtle, but it was there. Something inside her had shifted. She had faced the darkest part of the journey, the part where it seemed impossible to keep moving forward, and had come out stronger. The exhaustion still lingered, and the work was just as difficult, but Sarah no longer felt crushed by it. She had found a new strength within herself, one that didn't come from just physical endurance, but from the belief that every small victory mattered. Every step she took, no matter how small, was one step closer to creating the life she and Liam deserved. That resolve didn't just appear overnight. It came from the moments of quiet reflection, the hours spent fixing what she could, and the constant reminder that her son needed her, just as she needed him. In those moments when the weight of the world felt too heavy, she found solace in the most simple things. Liam's laughter, the warmth of the fire, the feeling of progress when one more piece of the cabin fell into place. One evening, as Sarah stood in the garden, watching Liam play with a small wooden toy, a thought crossed her mind that she hadn't considered before. Maybe this cabin wasn't just a place. Maybe it was more than that. It had become a symbol of her perseverance, a testament to the strength she hadn't known she had. And just as the earth had taken root after the harsh winter, so too had Sarah's heart healed in the quiet moments of rebuilding. Her resolve was now stronger than ever. There was no going back, no more doubting her own abilities. Sarah knew what she had to do, and though the road ahead would be challenging, she was ready for it. It was time to take her place in the world, not just as a woman fighting for survival, but as a mother who had created something lasting, something her son could inherit. It was time to give Liam a legacy. As Sarah continued to strengthen the foundation of her new life, something deeper began to stir within her. She had been so focused on survival, on getting through the day-to-day struggles, that she hadn't fully appreciated the significance of what she was doing. It wasn't just about fixing the cabin. It wasn't just about patching the roof or planting the garden. It was about healing, about restoring not just the broken pieces of wood and brick, but the broken parts of herself. One afternoon, while searching through some old boxes that had been tucked away in a corner of the cabin, Sarah stumbled upon a box of photographs. They were faded, worn, and yellowing with age, but as she carefully flipped through them, she felt a flood of memories rise to the surface. Some were of her childhood, others of her and Liam's father before everything had fallen apart. The memories were bittersweet, filled with moments of love and loss. The life she once dreamed of, the family she had imagined, seemed so far removed from the woman she was now. But as Sarah looked at the photographs, something shifted inside her. She didn't have to erase the past to move forward. The life she had once envisioned wasn't lost, it was simply transformed. What she was building now was its own kind of legacy, a legacy of resilience, strength, and love. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. She carefully placed the photographs on the mantel, arranging them in a way that felt right. They weren't just reminders of what had been, they were symbols of what had led her to this point. The struggles, the heartache, the lessons learned, they had all brought her here, to this moment, to this cabin that had once seemed like an impossible dream. And now, it was home. That night, as Sarah sat by the fire, holding Liam in her lap, she realized that this was the moment of restoration she had been waiting for. The cabin had become more than just a shelter. It had become a place of healing, a place where the past and future could coexist, where she could finally let go of the burdens that had weighed her down for so long. Sarah smiled as Liam fell asleep in her arms, his breath soft and steady. She was no longer just rebuilding a cabin, she was rebuilding herself. And for the first time in a long while, she felt whole. As the months passed, Sarah began to see the fruits of her labor in ways she had never imagined. The cabin, once a place of despair and uncertainty, had slowly transformed into a warm, welcoming home. The cracks in the walls were no longer visible, the roof was solid, and the floor, once uneven and unstable, now supported them with quiet strength. But the most important change wasn't in the physical structure, it was in the way Sarah viewed herself. She no longer saw herself as someone struggling to survive. She had become someone who had built something from the ground up, who had created not only a home but a future. And that realization settled deep within her heart. She had found peace, not just in the cabin, but within herself. The fear, the doubts, and the insecurities that had once held her captive were slowly fading, replaced by a quiet confidence. She was not just the woman who fixed things. She was the woman who could make things better, even when the odds were against her. One evening, as Sarah stood on the porch looking out at the land she had worked so hard to cultivate, she felt a sense of completion. The cabin was everything she had dreamed of and more. It wasn't perfect, nothing in life ever was, but it was theirs. It was her creation, built on love, hard work, and an unwavering belief that it could be done. Liam, now walking and running around with boundless energy, came to her side, tugging at her sleeve. "Look, Mama," he said, his face lit with excitement as he pointed to the small garden she had planted. The flowers and vegetables had begun to bloom, and the garden was flourishing in ways she had only hoped for. In that moment, Sarah realized that this home, this life, wasn't just for her. It was for Liam too. It was a place where he could grow, a place filled with the love and strength she had put into every nail, every brick, and every garden bed. Sarah knelt down to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You know," she said softly, "this is where we belong. This is our home. And it's going to be the place where your dreams grow. just like these flowers. As she stood up and gazed across the land, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had come full circle, from a broken woman standing in a crumbling cabin to a mother, a builder, and a symbol of perseverance. She had created a life that was filled with hope. The journey hadn't been easy, and it had been full of moments when giving up seemed like the only option. But now, as she looked at the life she had built, Sarah knew that every step, every hardship, had led her here. And here was where they belonged. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the fields as Sarah stood outside, her arms crossed, surveying the work that had been done. Her cabin stood proudly in the distance, its sturdy walls and freshly painted trim now looking like something out of a dream. It was no longer a dilapidated ruin, but a home filled with promise and purpose. The garden, which had once been a barren patch of earth, now flourished with bright vegetables and wildflowers, the colors a sharp contrast to the rich green grass around it. Liam, now nearly 2, ran through the garden with his arms outstretched, his laughter filling the air. The sight of him, healthy and full of life, brought a smile to Sarah's face. He had been the driving force behind every nail driven into the cabin, every ounce of energy spent on fixing what was broken. He had been her reason for fighting, for believing that there was something worth fighting for. As she watched him, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the beginning, to the moment she had first stepped inside this cabin. She had been scared, unsure, and alone. It had felt like an impossible task, too much to fix, too little time, and no clear way forward. But now, standing here, Sarah realized that those early days had been the hardest, but also the most important. They had laid the foundation, not just for a physical home, but for a new life, one where hope and resilience were the bedrock. Her fingers brushed against the smooth wooden railing of the porch as she made her way back inside. The familiar creak of the door sounded in the quiet evening air, a comforting reminder of how far they had come. The cabin was now everything it was meant to be, a refuge, a place of warmth, love, and growth. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was theirs, and that was enough. As Sarah prepared dinner in the small, cozy kitchen, she reflected on the incredible transformation she had witnessed, not just in the cabin, but in herself. The woman who had walked through the door of that crumbling building months ago was a different person. She was stronger now, more confident, and far more capable than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about repairing the cabin, it was about repairing herself. She had rebuilt a home, but more importantly, she had rebuilt her life. And every effort, every small victory, had led to this moment, this sense of peace that now settled in her heart. Dinner was simple, a stew, fresh bread, and a few vegetables from the garden, but it was the best meal she'd had in a long time. Liam sat at the table, eagerly reaching for his food, and Sarah watched him, her heart swelling with pride. This was the life she had fought for, and it was finally coming together. The evening stretched on, the warmth of the fire filling the cabin. Sarah and Liam sat on the couch, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight. As she looked around the room, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The cabin had come alive in a way she never thought possible. And it had done so because of her perseverance, and because of the love she poured into it. It was a legacy she would pass down to Liam, a place where he would grow, learn, and one day call home. The sound of Liam's soft breathing beside her brought Sarah back to the present. She kissed his forehead gently, her heart filled with gratitude. She had done it. She had given them both something to be proud of. As she closed her eyes, the weight of the past year seemed to lift. All the struggles, the doubts, and the fear had been worth it. They had a future, they had a home. And as the night wore on, Sarah allowed herself to dream of the years ahead, of Liam growing up in this cabin, making memories, and perhaps, one day, building a life of his own. Whatever came next, she knew they could handle it. Together. Sarah woke early, as she always did, the first light of dawn peeking through the small cracks in the curtains. The day stretched ahead, and although she had worked tirelessly for months, it still felt like there was more to do, more to build, more to grow. The future was a bright, open canvas, and she was ready to fill it with whatever came next. She glanced over at Liam, still peacefully asleep in his crib, his little chest rising and falling with each breath. A soft smile crossed Sarah's face. The cabin was no longer just a building, it was a living testament to her strength, to her unyielding spirit. Every room told a story of struggle, of hope, and of triumph. And now, she could finally breathe easy, knowing that she had created something real, something lasting. Today, she would begin working on the garden again. The seeds she had planted a few months ago had sprouted, and the rows of vegetables were growing well. It was a modest garden, but it had become a symbol of her resilience, a place where new life could begin to grow after all the hardships they had endured. But Sarah also had dreams beyond the cabin. She thought about the future, about what Liam would need to thrive, and how she could continue to nurture him, guide him, and teach him the lessons that had been so important to her. She wanted him to know the value of hard work, of resilience, and most importantly, the value of never giving up. She had shown him that, and he would carry that strength with him throughout his life. There was also the community. Sarah had never realized how important it was to have people around her who cared, who were there to lend a hand when needed. The town had become more than just a place to live, it had become her family. She thought about how, one day, she would pass on what she had learned, perhaps even share the story of the cabin with others who might be struggling, who might feel as lost as she once did. She could offer them a hand, just as others had done for her. But for now, Sarah was content. The cabin, the life she had built, was enough. She had fought for it, worked for it, and now, it was hers to enjoy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was hers, and that was all she had ever wanted. As the morning light filled the room, Sarah stood up, ready to start the day. There was work to do, but she wasn't afraid. She had made it this far, and there was no stopping her now. The future was wide open, full of endless possibilities. And with Liam by her side, she knew they could face anything that came their way. Taking a deep breath, Sarah looked out the window, her heart swelling with pride. This was only the beginning.